Well, again, good to see everyone. Tonight we are continuing with our study in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles as we're looking at the period of the divided kingdom in Judah and Israel, and through this study we're hopefully growing and thinking about these historical events that happened, that we can learn from them, and again continue to challenge ourselves and take away what we can from these messages. As we have looked at in our last few studies here, we looked at Uzziah and kind of he only reigned for a year and it wasn't good. We've noted how he was tied to the house of Joram, to Ahab's house, and that had caused him a great deal of trouble. You know, it had even caused his father Jehoshaphat. Remember the trouble it caused him. It was even worse for Uzziah. And then we began to look at Jehu and how God, through Jehu, brought judgment on Joram in Israel and Uzziah in Judah. And that's what we were talking about last week. In this study, we'll continue talking about Jehu. We'll move into Athaliah, the mother there of Uzziah, and what she did, and what resulted as of her wickedness. And then the son of Uzziah, Joash, or some in different places he's called Joash and then Jehoash, and so we'll look at him as well in Judah. As we go back into looking at Jehu, we were noting how Jehu had been used by God as his hand of judgment. In our last class, we looked at how God had used him in bringing that judgment on these two men. He assassinated them. Where were they? I forgot to bring my map out, but
Naboth's vineyard.
They were near Naboth's vineyard. If you remember, there in Jezreel, Jehu was over in Ramoth Gilead, where originally was where those two men were, but when Joram was injured, they moved him to Jezreel. That's where Uzziah went and met him. Well, God sends his messenger to Jehu, anoints him to be king. Then Jehu charges across the land to Jezreel, and there he finds these two kings, and there he assassinates. They're near the vineyard of Naboth. Is where he assassinates Joram, and then the body of Joram is brought there, and that's where his final remains were left. Well, who else was in Jezreel at the time? But another lady we know all too well, Jezebel. Jezebel was there. So if we go to 2 Kings chapter 9, we'll note here some of the events that occurred near the end of her life. We've already covered this. I'll try to be briefer with it because I know you've already heard it. But just as a way of reminder, verse 30 tells us that Jehu then he left Naboth's vineyard there. He then goes back to Jezreel, which wasn't too far away. He goes back to Jezreel, and there he finds Jezebel. Now, in a very similar way, as the watchmen had asked, do you come in peace? She too asked that question. The text tells us that Jezebel had heard of his coming, and probably, well, we know she had already heard how he had killed Joram and probably Uzziah. And so she calls out, is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master? Now, we do need to kind of think here about what Jehu has done. I mean, this was treason. You don't just kill your king. Now, he had been ordained to do it because God told him to, but the way some might have looked at it was treason. And so she's basically calling him a traitor. And then he asks a question. He says, he looks up where the window is. He says, who is on my side? And 2 or 3 eunuchs. I think it's interesting. He doesn't say how many. It says 2 or 3. It's not very specific there, but it says 2 or 3 of the eunuchs. Now, what's a eunuch in this regard? What would that likely be referring to? A eunuch.
Unable to father children and all that.
Yeah.
Specially chosen, I guess, or appointed servant.
Yeah. So the eunuch part, of course, is where you've been sterilized. You can't have children. But the purpose is they were a special servant of usually some high appointed official, like a king would have eunuchs or a queen, right? And we see a eunuch in the New Testament, right? Who's the eunuch we see in the New Testament? Acts 8, right? Acts 8, the Ethiopian eunuch. The Ethiopian eunuch. If I can slow my words down there. What was a high-ranking official, or the attendant to a high-ranking official as well. And so these 2 or 3 pop their heads out and they affirm, hey, we're on your side. And then you have this kind of tough scene to think about. And so he says to them, throw her down. And that's what they do. I don't know how high this window was. It must have been fairly high. Because when they threw her out, she fell hard enough that she bled. Her blood splattered the walls, which then caused the horses around, probably startled them, and then they began to trample her body. Now, that wasn't the end for her. I mean, she may have been dead at this point, at least unconscious, but then the dogs came and devoured her. And so just a very brutal thing. After they throw her out and she's there laying on the ground, her body is, he goes in, he eats, and after he gets done eating, he says, well, we should probably go get the body and at least bury her, because she was royalty. He goes out, what does he find? Yeah, her skull, her palms, right? Not very much. And then he recalls in that moment, interestingly enough, he says, they came back and told him. So they go out, they look, they see what happened, they come back telling. And then he recalls to his mind the prophecy of Elijah when he says, this is verse 36, this is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite in the territory of Jezreel. The dogs in the territory of Jezreel, the dog shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the face of the field of the territory of Jezreel, so that no one can say this is Jezebel. So what's significant about what just happened?
The fact that Jehu understood what Elijah said, it was a fulfillment of prophecy.
Yeah, so number one, it confirms prophecy, which again confirms the word of Elijah, the word of God. And the way she died was very dishonorable. Number one, she was eaten by animals. That was, number one, a very dishonorable death. And there wasn't even enough to bury her. So she didn't even have a royal... So she wasn't taken back to be buried in the royal tombs. And we're going to see that again as we move forward, where some other people, we've read it in the past, where you've had royalty who weren't buried with the royalty. Well, that was a kind of a slap on the face, on the memory of someone to do that. And so here God wanting to bring real disdain on the name of Jezebel. So Jehu executes Jezebel as God brings his judgment on her. Jehu then moves in chapter 10 to kill Ahab's descendants. Now, why is that significant?
God said it would happen.
Because what?
God said it would happen.
God said it would happen.
It ends the line.
It ends the line, right? God said, I'm going to cut off the house of Ahab, just like I did with Jeroboam, just like I did with Nashon and some of these others. So let's go to chapter 10 and just notice what happens here. Verse 1 tells us that now Ahab had 70 sons. Now this goes back to Ahab. He's got a big family. This is a huge family. They're in Samaria. You would think that to be the case. So when you had a king from a particular line, that wasn't all the people, right? These families were huge. And so Ahab had a huge family. So he wrote letters. So he's going to rid the land of the house of Ahab. Well, he devises a plan to do that. He sends out these letters to Samaria, to the rulers of the city, to the elders, to the guardians of the sons of Ahab, saying, now then, as soon as this letter comes to you, seeing your master's sons are with you, there are with you chariots and horses, fortified cities also, and weapons. Select the best and fittest of your master's sons, and set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. So he's a way to bring division, I guess, of the kingdom here. So that's what he says. He's basically saying we're going to go to war now. And that's what would likely happen in most kingdoms, was you'd end up in civil war when you have a king who dies without a real line to follow him. And so it's interesting how they react. Verse 4, how did they react? It says they were exceedingly afraid and said, behold, the two kings could not stand before him. Who are those two kings? Come on, y'all got to talk to me.
The one that killed Ahab.
Huh? Joram and Hazael, right? Joram and Hazael, they say they couldn't stand before him. They couldn't stop him. What are we going to do? I'm paraphrasing a little bit. And so he was, see. How then can we stand? Verse 5. So he who was over the palace and he who was over the city, together with the elders and the guardians, sent to Jehu, saying, we are your servants, and we will do all that you tell us. We will not make anyone king. Do whatever is good in your eyes. So they all side with Jehu, which Jehu, technically, did he have any right to the throne from a human perspective? No, he wasn't in the kingly line. He was not connected to them. But all these people kind of look at him and they're like, well, he's a lot more scary than those descendants of Ahab. So we're going to go with you. And they go beyond that, don't they? And so verse 6, he wrote them a second letter. He says, if you're on my side and if you are ready to obey me, take the heads of your master's sons and come to me at Jezreel tomorrow at this time. That's why you better be careful who you trust, especially if you're in a place of power. Right? Go ask, what's his name? Ben-Hadad, with Hazael. He trusted him, and then he got smothered with a pillow. And now you got all these servants or under officials who all decide, we're going to listen to Jehu. I don't care what Ahab's descendant tells me to do. So he says, you bring me their heads at Jezreel. So now the king's sons, 70 persons, were with the great men of the city who were bringing them up. And as soon as the letter came to them, they took the king's sons and slaughtered them, 70 persons, and put their heads in baskets and sent them to him at Jezreel. Brutal. Right? And it's true, television, some movies and stuff, they can get really brutal. But what do you know about all them? It's not real, right? It's all Hollywood deal. This is real. This is real. 70 men were just slaughtered at the command of one man. 70. And so they send these heads on, and I want you to know why he does it. I think it's kind of interesting why he's having them do this, and he's not just bringing his soldiers and having it done. When the messengers came and told him, verse 8, they had brought the heads of the king's son, he said, lay them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until morning. Why do that? Can you imagine the smell? Oh, it must have stunk terribly. And also just the sight of that. Oh, why did he do that for?
To send a message, maybe.
I think definitely to send a message. What's the message?
Don't mess with me.
Don't mess with me. Right, this is I'm in charge now. So he says that, verse 9, then in the morning he went out and stood and said to all the people. Now notice this. You are innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him. All right, so he says, what he's talking about, you're innocent of the death of Joram. I did that. I was the one that shot the bow and killed him. Right? That's me. But notice, he has a little trickery here. He says, you're innocent of that. You weren't a traitor against the king. That was me. But notice. But who struck down all of these? Again, why did he put those heads there? It makes a powerful illustration, doesn't it? And I can just imagine he's standing there and he says, but what about all these? Verse 10, know then that there shall fall to earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab. For the Lord has done what he said by his servant Elijah. So, what did he do skillfully here with the people?
He claimed to be doing the will of God.
Okay, he did that. But before we go there, that's true. He brought them in. He said, you're part of this now. So he says, we're all in this together. So in other words, you can't just go off and go behind me now. All right, you're as much guilty of what happened as I am because you cut those heads off.
Well, he also got rid of the chance of any of those sons claiming to run later.
Yeah. I mean, he cut that line off. So the line of Omri, who replaced Baasha, I believe it was Baasha, wasn't it? It was Zimri. Omri had replaced Zimri. So all the house of Omri is gone now. So now who's king? And he's like,
Jehu.
Jehu is. And then he says it's because God determined it to be. And God did. Right? And so he not only invokes their own part in this, but he says God was the one who ordained all of this. But very brutal, isn't it? Sin always destroys, it never builds up. It never brings new, it never brings justice, it never brings good things, it always brings bad things. And so to clean this up, a lot of people died. I'm going to come back to that as we move forward. That's a thing that continues to happen. Why all this brutality? Why all this brutality? Sin.
When you go back to the Old Testament somewhere, God told the people even before they come into the land to not allow evil to remain among you. If evil happens, you kill the people, so that people will learn and not repeat the evil that they did. And they haven't learned that since they became kingdoms. They just allowed it to continue.
Over and over again.
I'm just wondering, some of that, isn't that going back to say, I told you to get rid of it. Don't let it dwell among you, because it's just going to breed more. Let it stay.
And that's going to be a lesson for Jehu to remember too, and he doesn't remember. But we'll get to there in a minute, but you're right. So the house of Ahab, house of Omri, gone. All right, so he also then, he did some good things. Again, another brutal action, but go on in the text here. Let's go down. Let's go down to verse 18. Let's see, hold on. There was something else I wanted you to note. So he mentions that about God in verse 10. And then verse 11 tells us that he went through, and I'm going to summarize some of this, but he goes through and he strikes down all the remainder of the house of Ahab, even the servants. So he's getting rid of any influence of Ahab anywhere. And he does a thorough job of it. It says that all his great men and his close friends and his priest, he left him none remaining. Like, it was a total spring cleaning, if you will, of the house of Ahab. It is gone. Verse 12 and following, he then set out and went to Samaria. He wasn't done yet. And on his way, he was at Beth Eked of the shepherds. There he met the relatives of Hazael, a bunch of princes. There were 42 of them. What did he do? He eliminated them as well. So he did some work for Judah as well. Sorry, my wife's talking to me. But he wiped them out, 42 of them, and then continued on. Now, you go along and all these people are dying. Then he gets to Jehonadab, and you think, well, is Jehonadab in trouble as well? Well, he's not. He actually comes into the company of Jehu, and then Jehu goes on with him. It says in verse 17, when he came to Samaria, he struck down all who remained to Ahab in Samaria till he'd wiped them out, according to the word of the Lord that spoke to Elijah. So, just thoroughly went through and eliminated the house of Ahab. All right, so he's done that. Now Ahab's gone. Now, what had been one of the great sins of Ahab and Jezebel?
They celebrated Baal.
Baal worship. Now, there were other idolatries that had occurred. The Astrium and some others. Those aren't going to go away, unfortunately. But Baal worship, remember, it was the prophets of Baal that Elijah had to fight over and over again. It was those who had, it was Jezebel who killed all the prophets of God and had gotten so upset when Elijah had all the prophets of Baal killed. Well, one of their big evil influences was in Baal worship. Well, so now he turns his attention to that. He again acts very slyly. Verse 18 tells us he assembled all the people and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu will serve him much. He lies, all right. Now therefore call to me all the prophets of Baal, all his worshipers, and all his priests. Let none be missing, for I have a great sacrifice to offer to Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. So he makes a demand. I want every Baal worshiper, every Baal priest, I want them all the prophets to come to Samaria. So, they do that. But now notice the end of verse 19. But Jehu did it with cunning in order to destroy the worshippers of Baal. Jehu ordered, sanctify a solemn assembly for Baal. So they proclaimed it. So he sends, verse 21, he sent throughout all Israel a calling of these worshippers of Baal. And the text tells us, so there was not a man left who did not come. It must have been a huge number in Samaria. A lot of people. And so they go into the house of Baal, this false temple for Baal. And he even has them bring out the wardrobe, all the vestments, all their things they wear. Put them on, right? We're going to offer this big old sacrifice. The text tells us that the place was filled to the brim. I was trying to look for that. I don't know if I have that here. But it was filled from side to side. I mean, it was packed in there. And so they're all in there. They begin to offer the sacrifice. Now what, again, I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but he has them all inside. And then in the meanwhile, he has under the wire here gotten stationed 80 men around this temple, the soldiers to cover every exit. He tells them that if you let one person escape, it's on you. You do not let one worshiper of Baal escape. They go in, and you want to talk about slaughter. They kill every one of these individuals. What that must have looked like. I mean, it must have been. Those soldiers, you think about what it must have been like for those soldiers who did that. And that had to be hard to even deal with. I imagine when they came out, they were all bloody. Right? You think about that. Think about the brutality of this. They go in, they get the pillar of Baal, they destroy it, they destroy the house. There's a little interesting note at the end, kind of a humorous note, that the house of Baal became a latrine. Kind of as a joke, I guess, against Baal and the worship of the house of Baal. But he brutally rips Baal worship and worshipers out of Israel. Yes, ma'am.
What was the purpose of the robes?
The vestments.
All of them wear robes.
It would have been the like in some religious groups they have certain attire that the priest or the preacher or reverend or whatever they call them will wear. I mean, it's just those kind of things. What's that? Yeah. I mean, and he even had them in there doing a worship ceremony, kind of a final judgment on them. What they were doing was idolatries.
Even the Jews had that, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Even in Judaism.
Special vestments for the Levites,
Mm-hmm.
especially the high priest, and they didn't come into God's presence without those special vestments on. So it really sets you apart as you are here to be God's specific instrument to lead the worship of the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And like when God is speaking to Moses, I mean, he's very detailed about the vestments that the high priest and the other priests would wear. Good point. So, I mean, he does that. I mean, he just kind of rips out Baal worship by the root and just destroys all of this, all these people and all of the things about it. Any other questions about that second?
I may be confusing Baal with one of the others, but wasn't Baal when they offered the human sacrifice?
So that's not Baal as far as I know, but it was Moloch,
No, this was with him.
the god of Moloch.
It seems sort of funny that after Elijah had killed the prophets of Baal on the mount, that it rebuilt. Jehu had to come back and redo that again.
Yeah, and it kind of speaks to how much a part of the culture it had become. Like it had really taken root in Israel. And it had even gotten into, and we'll see this in a minute, in Judah. Like Judah had a big problem with this too. They had to root it out as well. But it had become so much a part of their everyday life. You're right. I mean, even after what Elijah did, he killed 400 prophets, and it didn't halt it. And Jezebel seemed to be kind of one of the big driving forces of Baal worship in Israel.
A headlight, I guess, for us to watch out for what the evil one could do. Because even with Elijah, afterwards it was like, okay, which one's God? And the people coming out after God ate up the sacrifices and burned up the water in the trough and all that kind of stuff. They go, oh yeah, God is God, God is God. And the people participate with Elijah to take the people out, kill them and all that stuff.
And it was the people that killed the prophets, right? It wasn't Elijah that did that.
Right.
It was the ones that did it, and yet they ventured back to it.
Just a few years later, here they are again, lost in...
And something else to think about along these same lines is, why did it get into Judah?
Tie probably between Ahab and the king of Judah, the family on the line is a tie.
It was started with Jehoshaphat, right? He married a daughter of Ahab. And then Hazael had married a daughter of Ahab.
And God had warned them, every generation he warned, not let this start.
Yeah. And again, why did this have to happen? It all goes back to sin, right? They had ventured away from God, and this influence had grown. Sin is like a cancer in a society, and it will destroy you. And it had to be ripped out in a very brutal way. Didn't have to happen, but because they would not listen to God, this is what happened. And then as we get to the end of chapter 10, we do find out that he, after wiping out Baal from Israel, verse 28, the text says something interesting, and we... it says he did not turn aside from... So he wiped out Baal worship, but what did he not do?
Didn't get rid of
The rest.
Yeah. It's the same kind of symptom that happened with Jehoshaphat, right? Jehoshaphat went in and made these huge reforms, but what did he not do? He did not take down the high places. He left them there. They continued to influence Judah. Jehu had just done all this for God. He tore out Baal worship, but then he allowed them to continue in idolatry. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's hard to know, but do we ever, as followers of God, ever get tired of doing the right thing? Does it ever become hard and then you just start to say, oh, I just can't do it? Oh, take your kids. Do your kids ever wear you out? Your grandkids ever wear you out? And eventually you give in, not because you want to, but because you're just tired. And it's almost like these guys, I don't know, it's just like they cannot go the whole way. And it's a problem.
I hate to say tired, but maybe weary.
Weary, yeah. Yeah. So it says he continued in the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. What was Jeroboam's sin? The golden calves. He goes back to that, right? So Jeroboam introduced the golden calves. You know what? They're still there at this point in the text. They're still one in Dan and Bethel. They're still continuing to serve those idols. It was just Baal. He picked out one thing to take hold of, but he didn't see the other, which he should have. And the Lord said to Jehu, he still gave him a compliment, because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes. and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. Eventually, even the throne of Jehu, the family of Jehu, will be taken out of power. But 4 sons will reign from Jehu in Israel. Unfortunately, they're not good reigns. But God says, because you have done this, I will bless you in this way. Verse 31 tells us that he was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn from the sin of Jeroboam, which he made sin. You notice how it just repeats that over and over again. You know, can we do a good thing for God, but yet that still not save us? We can. Just because we do one good thing for God, sometimes we live on our accomplishments, don't we? We romanticize the past and the one good thing we did. Does God expect just one good thing from us? What does he want from us? What does he want?
A long obedience in the same direction. You don't keep up, just day after day, it's got to be the same thing.
A lifetime of obedience, right? And none of us can rest on our laurels in that. We've got to continue to fight for God. Verse 32, and I'll end this real quick. I know the time's out. But in those days, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. So, God says you'll stay, your family will be on the throne for 4 generations. However, did he not suffer punishment? He still suffered punishment. The text tells us in those days God began to cut off parts of Israel. Hazael, remember we talked about Hazael earlier. He was going to cause a lot of problems for Israel. Well, he did. He began to cut off parts of Israel. Hazael divided them throughout the territory of Israel from Jordan eastward. And he lists several places there. We don't have time to go over them. And then he goes on to talk about, verse 35, he slept with his fathers. They buried him in Samaria. Jehoaz, his son, reigned in his place. The time that Jehu reigned over Israel in Samaria was 28 years. So that kind of brings the reign of Jehu to an end. Next week we'll get into Athaliah. So you got all this going on in the north. What's going on in the south? So next week we'll talk about Athaliah. Hazael is dead. You got to find a king. Where's the king? That'll lead to some interesting events. Thank you all so much. We'll be dismissed. Rejoin for worship in just a few minutes.